As big rig truck drivers crisscross their way through the United States, past spacious skies, amber waves of grain, and purple mountains, they seem to be an ignored and ordinary part of the United States. If you think about driving down your local highways and byways, you notice these semi-trucks all of the time, but you don't, however, really see them. That is the problem, and today we are going to discuss a case that let the obscurity of these long-haul drivers become a factor. I'm John Dodson, and today on The Secret Sits, we are going to be exploring the story of the Happy Face Killer. On February 5th, 1990, the Multnomah County Police Department received an anonymous phone call from a woman claiming she had overheard a man in a bar bragging about committing the murder of 23-year-old Tanya Bennett of Portland, Oregon. Bennett had gone missing on January 21st and was found deceased on January 22nd, lying on the side of an embankment along the old Columbia River Highway in the Columbia River Gorge just east of Portland. She had been beaten, sexually assaulted, and strangled to death. The anonymous caller identified the braggart as 39-year-old John Sonowski. But his name was misspelled in the report, which prevented a follow-up from the sheriff's office. The following week, another call was placed to Clackamas County Police. In this report, John's name was correctly spelled, and law enforcement began investigating him as a potential suspect. At the time, John was a parolee who had previous DUI offenses. Through police correspondence with John's parole officer, it was determined that the caller who implicated him was Laverne Pavlinac, John's 57-year-old girlfriend. Both Laverne and John were separately interviewed by law enforcement, and Laverne was sent home with a recording wire, which police hoped to use in order to record John implicating himself in conversation. However, John failed to implicate himself. In subsequent interviews, Laverne told law enforcement that on the night of January 21st, she had received a phone call from John, who told her he was in trouble and asked her to meet him at a truck stop in Troutdale. Upon her arrival, she claimed that John was hiding between two large trailers and that the body of Bennett lay wrapped in a blanket at his feet. Laverne initially thought she was ill, but was told by John that she was in fact dead. Laverne claimed the two rolled Bennett's body into a shower curtain that she had brought with her and disposed of the body along the old Columbia River Highway, around 20 miles east in the Columbia River Gorge. She also stated that before disposing of Bennett's body, John cut a piece of fabric from her jeans to keep as a souvenir. Laverne accompanied law enforcement to the truck stop where she had identified the specific location she claimed to have seen John standing with Bennett's body. She also accompanied them to the location where Bennett's body had been found, accurately identifying it. Based on Laverne's interviews with law enforcement, John was arrested. And this is where our story really begins. Keith Hunter Jesperson was born on April 6, 1955, to Leslie and Gladys Jesperson in Chilliwack, British Columbia, Canada. The middle child of two brothers and two sisters, his father was a domineering alcoholic, and Jesperson claimed that his paternal grandfather was also violent. Les Jesperson denied being an abusive parent. However, while investigating for his book on Jesperson, author Jack Olson was able to confirm much of the claimed abuse with other family members. Treated like an outcast by his own family and teased by other children for his large size at a young age, Jesperson was a lonely child who showed a propensity for torturing and killing animals. Despite consistently getting into trouble in his youth, including twice attempting to kill children who had crossed him, Jesperson graduated from high school, secured a job as a truck driver in 1974, got married a year later, and had 3 children. In 1990, after 15 years of marriage, Jesperson was divorced and saw his dreams to become a Royal Canadian Mounted Policeman dashed following an injury. After returning to truck driving, it was that year that Jesperson began to kill. In his younger years, Jesperson was given less attention than his siblings and treated differently by the rest of his family. After moving to Selah, Washington, Jesperson had trouble fitting in and making friends because of his large size. His brothers did not help him. Instead, they nicknamed him Igor or Iggy, a name that stuck throughout his school years. Because of this, he was a shy child, content to play by himself much of the time. He would often get into trouble for behaving badly, sometimes violently, and would be severely punished by his father. This included beatings, sometimes with a belt in front of others, and in one case, he received an electric shock from his father. At a very early age, as young as 5, Jesperson would capture and torture animals. He enjoyed watching animals kill each other, as well as the feeling he got from taking their lives himself. This continued as he got older. He would capture birds and stray cats and dogs from around the trailer park where he lived with his family, severely beating the animals and then strangling them to death, something for which he claims his father was proud of him. In the years following, Jesperson said he often thought about what it would be like to do the same to a human. That desire manifested in 2 attempted murders. The first happened when Jesperson was around 10 years old. He was friends with a boy named Martin, and the two would often get into trouble together. Jesperson claimed he was punished many times for things Martin had done and blamed on Jesperson. This led Jesperson to attack Martin, violently beating him until his father pulled him away. He later claimed his intention was to kill the boy. Approximately 1 year later, Jesperson was swimming in a lake when another boy held him underwater until he blacked out. Some time later, at a public pool, Jesperson attempted to drown the boy by holding his head under the water until the lifeguard pulled him away. Jesperson reported that he lost his virginity because he was raped at age 14. He graduated from high school in 1973, but did not attend college because his father did not believe that he could do it. Although he was not successful with girls in high school, having never even attended a school dance or his prom, he did enter into a relationship after high school. In 1975, when Jesperson was 20, he married Rose Huck, and the couple had 3 children, 2 daughters, and 1 son. Several years later, Huck began to suspect Jesperson was having affairs when strange women would call the house. Tension in the marriage increased, and after 14 years, while Jesperson was on the road, Huck packed up her and her children's belongings and drove 200 miles away to live with her parents in Spokane, Washington. The oldest child, Melissa, was 10 years old. Jesperson continued to spend time with his children when he was in town. The couple divorced in 1990. At the age of 35, standing 6 foot 7.5 inches tall and weighing approximately 240 pounds, Jesperson began working toward the goal of being a Royal Canadian Mounted Policeman. But an injury suffered while training ended his dream. He then sought work again as an interstate truck driver after relocating to Cheney, Washington. Jesperson soon realized that this job afforded him the opportunity to kill without being suspected. On Tuesday evening, January 23, 1990, pretty 23-year-old Tanya Bennett decided to go out for a few drinks and to hopefully meet up with a few of her friends. It was a cold, damp night, typical weather for that time of year in Portland, Oregon, which could arguably be placed among the top 10 rain capitals of the world. But Tanya dressed appropriately. After grabbing her purse and umbrella, she climbed into her car and drove towards the B&I Tavern, one of her favorite haunts, on Portland, Oregon's southeast side. Upon her arrival at the tavern, Tanya, unable to make up her mind about what she wanted to drink, settled on a beer, and then a wine cooler, and then continued to switch back and forth between the two drinks as the evening wore on. Before long, Tanya, who has been described by family members and friends as mentally slow and possibly slightly retarded, became visibly intoxicated. At first, Tanya never paid much attention to the tall, burly-looking, loudmouth man sitting at the bar, and judging from all of his outward appearances, bar patrons would later say that he hadn't paid much attention to Tanya either, until later in the evening, after it had become apparent that Tanya was feeling the effects of the alcohol, and he had been watching her all right, mentally making plans for the remainder of the evening. A little later, the man casually walked over to the pool table area where Tanya had been watching the players with a glass of beer in his hand. He introduced himself to her and offered to buy her a drink. She accepted, and unbeknownst to her, set into motion a series of events that would ultimately end her young life. The man's name was Keith Hunter Jesperson, but Tanya may have known him only as Keith, or perhaps even by some other name. Jesperson was known to use a number of aliases, often a variation on his real name, and in all likelihood, he had used an alias on this particular evening. Whatever he had called himself that night, the 35-year-old, 6'7.5" tall hulk of a man who weighed 240 pounds had made quite an imprint on the young and impressionable Tanya. She had been easy to befriend, she trusted everyone, and hadn't yet really learned just how horrible some people can be. At one point, Jesperson excused himself and left the tavern for a while without explaining to Tanya where he was going. When he returned a short time later, he met Tanya outside and offered to buy her dinner. However, when he checked his wallet to see how much money he had left, he realized he didn't have enough cash to buy even himself dinner, much less dinner for himself and Tanya. He told Tanya that he had more money at home and invited her to accompany him there to get it. Tanya willingly agreed to accompany Jesperson to his residence, located nearby, and when they arrived, she followed him inside, unaware that the quest for cash had been merely a ruse to separate her from the tavern and the patrons inside it. Instead of retrieving money to buy dinner, he coaxed her into having sex. Later, as would become his custom, the pent-up anger that had been seething inside of Jesperson for so long made its way to the surface. Even before getting dressed after their sexual tryst, he began taunting Tanya, and before long was making mean, cruel remarks to her. And soon, they were into a full-blown argument during which Jesperson, by his own later admission, began striking her. When Tanya attempted to fight back and defend herself against this giant of a man, Jesperson began to viciously beat her about the face and head. In one swift movement, he placed one of his massive hands around her frail neck, and with the other, he grabbed a rope. Without even taking the time to think about his actions, Jesperson wrapped the rope around Tanya's neck and pulled it taut as he strangled her and watched the life slowly leave her body. When she ceased to struggle and her body became limp, he let her partially nude body slump to the floor. Jesperson didn't panic after killing Tanya. Leaving her inside the rented house, he drove back to the B&I Tavern and sat around drinking and talking to anyone who would listen to him, presumably to establish an alibi for himself. After a few more beers, Jesperson drove back to the house and calmly loaded Tanya's body into the front seat of a friend's car. Knowing that he had to dispose of the body, he drove eastward toward the Columbia River Gorge. Sticking to the old highway, which was much darker and far less traveled, and consisted of a series of curves and switchbacks, Jesperson found a suitable place near Crown Point, where it was secluded and dark. Just the right place to dump a body. He pulled the car over to the side and stopped. It was quiet, and there were no sounds of traffic in the distance. Confident that he was alone, Jesperson pulled Tanya's body out of the car and tossed it over an embankment of one of the switchbacks, discarding her corpse as if it were an unwanted piece of rubbish. After discarding Tanya's body, Jesperson exited the highway and tossed the Walkman she had left inside the car out of the window. He then drove to a truck stop near Troutdale and drank coffee the remainder of the night, yet another attempt to establish an alibi for himself if it turned out that one was needed. Afterward, just after dawn, and now wide awake on a caffeine high, Jesperson drove up the Sandy River Highway and flung the contents of Tanya's purse, which included her Oregon identification, as well as the purse itself, into a bushy area near the river. Days later, a passerby found Tanya's body, where it had landed in a ditch after tumbling down the embankment. Horrified by the grisly discovery, their passerby notified the police. Photos were taken. The crime scene was processed in the usual manner, and the body was taken to the morgue, where it was initially identified only as Jane Doe. Tanya's death didn't make much news at first in the local newspapers. The articles that first appeared consisted of only a few short paragraphs outlining the discovery of her body and the police statements that she was found half-dressed, beaten, and strangled to death, that one of her teeth had punctured through her lower lip, and the fact that she had a rope around her neck. A description of her physical appearance was also published, and it didn't take long for her body to be positively identified. The police had no suspects in the case, and for the time being, Keith Jesperson was free to roam in his quest for other victims. Now, back to how our story started with Laverne and John. A self-proclaimed armchair detective, Laverne, 57, read the news reports surrounding Tanya Bennett's death with great interest. An avid reader of mysteries and true crime books, as well as a devoted fan of television's Matlock, Laverne was familiar with police procedures. As more information became available about Tanya's murder, Laverne continued to read the newspaper and watch the television news reports, taking in as much of the information about the case as possible. She eventually decided that Tanya's case could serve as the perfect vehicle to end her abusive 10-year relationship with her live-in boyfriend, 43-year-old John. Before she put her plan into motion, Laverne first did her homework and learned that Oregon State Police Detective Alan Corson and Multnomah County Sheriff's Detective John Ingram were conducting the Tanya Bennett murder investigation. After working out a scenario in her mind, she called the detectives and told them that she had important information about the case. Corson and Ingram, both eager to solve the Bennett case, promptly went to Laverne's home to hear what she had to say. By the time detectives arrived, Laverne thought she had it all figured out, a foolproof way to get John out of her life for good, even if it meant that she might have to spend some time behind bars too. she told Corson and Ingram of her stormy relationship with John and how she had been roughed up at his hands for years. She also said that she was turning him in for the rape and murder of Tanya Bennett. The detectives, interested, listened as Laverne told them that she had been forced by John to help him rape Tanya Bennett. She explained in seemingly intricate detail about the rape, right down to the placement of the rope around Tanya's neck and her subsequent strangulation at what she claimed was John's hands. She also told detectives that John had forced her to assist him in disposing of the body and covering up the crime. Carson and Ingram didn't know quite what to make of Laverne's statement. Although eager to close the books on this case, they left Laverne's home that day without making any arrests, as they needed time to digest what they had been told. They also needed to talk to John, and when they did, he denied what Laverne had told them and claimed that he was innocent. Over the next several weeks, Corson and Ingram continued to interview Laverne about the case, sometimes of their own initiative, and sometimes due to calls that Laverne had made to their offices claiming to have additional information. On other occasions, the detectives took Laverne out to the Columbia River Gorge to see if she could point out specific locations that only the police and the killer would know about. She did very well and passed the test with regard to where Tanya's body had been dumped, but she was unable to point out other important things, such as where Tanya's personal belongings, purse, and so forth might be located. As the investigation continued, with Laverne and John clearly the prime suspects in the case, Corson and Ingram conferred with the Multnomah County Deputy District Attorney Jim McIntyre and turned over copies of their case materials to the prosecutor. As a result, Laverne and John were eventually arrested and charged with Tanya's death. Although he had originally claimed that he was innocent, John, facing a possible death penalty, pled guilty. Using Laverne's detailed confession, McIntyre was instrumental in getting both Laverne and John sentenced to prison in February 1991. Life for John and a minimum of 10 years for Laverne. It turned out to be more than she had bargained for, and before long, Laverne began claiming that she had made up the entire story to end her relationship with John. However, no one believed her now that she was behind bars. Meanwhile, with 2 people put away for a murder that they did not commit, Keith Jesperson remained free to roam the country, trolling for new victims. After getting his first taste of blood, so to speak, by murdering Tanya Bennett, Jesperson soon found he had become addicted to killing. Depending on whose account of Jesperson's activities one chooses to believe, either his own account or official accounts, it appears that Jesperson waited nearly a year and a half before committing his second murder, after which the others appeared to come in rapid succession. According to Jesperson's account, the next murder attributed to him occurred sometime in late July or early August of 1992. An unidentified woman's body was found on August 30th that year, approximately 10 miles north of Blythe, California, and investigators determined that she had been dead for a number of weeks. Labeled as Jane Doe by the police, Jesperson would later tell authorities that her name was Claudia. The following month, the body of Cynthia Lynn Rose, 32 years old, was found along U.S. Highway 99 near Turlock, California. She too had been dead for some time, and her death was originally listed as a drug overdose. However, it was about this time that Jesperson began writing letters to the media, particularly to a columnist for the Oregonian newspaper in Portland, Oregon, claiming responsibility for Rose's murder as well as others. In one letter, he had claimed that Rose was a sex worker he had picked up and murdered. He signed his letter with a smiling, happy face, and the columnist for the Oregonian quickly dubbed him, for lack of any other name, the Happy Face Killer. Although the letters were turned over to the police, there was little for investigators to go on with regards to identifying the letter writer, and Jesperson would maintain his anonymity until 1995. Lori Ann Pentland, 26 years old, became the next victim. Lori's body was found in November of 1992 behind a G.I. Joe store in Salem, Oregon, the state's capital, about 50 miles south of Portland. Detectives determined that she had been strangled, but were left with no leads as to who the killer might be. However, they would eventually learn the strangulation appeared to be the Happy Face Killer's preferred method of murder. The following July, another Jane Doe was found west of Santana, California, on a state highway near a truck turnout. The woman had been dead for only a couple of days when her body was found, and a county coroner listed her death as a drug overdose. Her case would eventually be reopened and looked at as a homicide after the Happy Face Killer wrote another letter and referred to her as a street person. The remains of what would be known as victim number 6 on the Happy Face Killer's list, another Jane Doe, was found more than a year later on September 14, 1994, west of Crestview, Florida, along Interstate 10, by a road crew working in the Florida Panhandle. The remains consisted of mostly bones of a woman that investigators believe had been approximately 40 years old at the time of her death. The following year, a detective will begin focusing on Jesperson as a possible suspect, but only after Jesperson claimed victim number 8 and following his apprehension. Although homicide detectives had made several attempts at identifying the woman through facial reconstruction for the time being, as with all of the other as yet unconnected cases, investigators had little to work with aside from the bones. Jesperson, however, would eventually claim that this victim's name was Suzanne. Somewhere, somebody is missing a daughter, a wife, or a sister, one of the Florida investigators said. Although her corpse would not be found until September 1995, 21-year-old Angela Sabrise of Oklahoma City would become Jesperson's 7th victim. Until then, few people would realize that Angela was even missing, much less dead, due to the transient lifestyle that she led. It wasn't until victim number 8 that Jesperson became careless by murdering someone that he knew instead of a complete stranger. Julie Ann Winningham, 41, of Camas, Washington, was believed to have been murdered on March 10, 1995. Like the others, she had been strangled, and her nude body had been dumped over an embankment alongside State Highway 14, just east of the Clark and Skamania County line. Unlike the others, Julie's friends and relatives knew that she had been seeing Jesperson and provided the first valuable link, his name, that would aid investigators in apprehending one of the most notorious serial killers in the past decades. Seasoned Clark County, Washington Sheriff's Department detective Rick Buckner, well known for his role in the Wesley Allen Dodd child murder investigations a few years earlier, caught the Julie Ann Winningham case assignment. Buckner initially learned that Winningham was a Camas resident who had relocated to Utah for a while after breaking up with her truck driver husband. According to those he interviewed, she returned to Camas in February 1995 with a man named Keith Jesperson, who she referred to as her fiancé. According to the information that Buckner uncovered, Winningham apparently met Jesperson at a truck stop in Utah and had hitched a ride with him back to Washington. A number of her acquaintances told Buckner that Jesperson was a big guy and some described him as a giant and a baby Huey type person. Buckner also learned that Jesperson had no criminal record in the state of Washington. He learned that Jesperson had married a woman named Rose in 1986, and they had 3 children. The only records that turned up his search for information about Jesperson were court records from Yakima County that showed that he and Rose had divorced in 1990. It didn't take long for Buckner to learn of the Cheney Trucking Company for which Jesperson worked. Company officials told Buckner that he traveled all over the country, and in the days immediately following Winningham's death, he was on the road in Pennsylvania. The company officials provided Buckner with Jesperson's travel itinerary back toward the West Coast, a route that would take him through Texas, New Mexico, and eventually to Arizona. By Wednesday, March 22, 1995, Buckner had traced Jesperson to Las Cruces, New Mexico, a city located in the southern part of the state near the Mexican border. With the help of sheriff's deputies in Las Cruces, Buckner and other detectives detained Jesperson for more than 6 hours and questioned him about the murder of Julie Winningham. By Jesperson's own account, Buckner and the other detective tried to get Jesperson to confess to Winningham's murder, but he wouldn't talk. Jesperson would later say that they kept asking him if he would want to talk about it or if he desired an attorney present during the questioning. And when he said that he did in fact want an attorney, they asked him why he needed one, whether he had done something that required a lawyer's assistance. Since he wouldn't talk and lacking any concrete evidence to arrest him, the detectives had no choice but to release him. Afterwards, Jesperson immediately headed for Arizona, and Buckner returned to Washington. While in southern Arizona, Jesperson attempted to assign some kind of reason to the murders of the women he had killed, or so he claimed. Unable to do so, he claimed that he made 2 attempts at suicide, the first on the evening of March 22nd, and the second attempt the following evening, each time overdosing himself on over-the-counter sleeping pills, and each time, he said, his body rejected the sleep aids. On March 24th, after apparently deciding that the cops would nail him for Julie Winningham's murder, and that he might fare considerably better with the judicial system if he turned himself in, Jesperson wrote 2 letters, one to his children and one to his brother. The letter to his brother in part read, "Seems like my luck has run out. I will never be able to enjoy life on the outside again. I got into a bad situation and got caught up with emotion. I killed a woman in my truck during an argument. With all the evidence against me, it looks like I truly am a black sheep. The court will appoint me a lawyer, and there will be a trial. I am sure they will kill me for this. I am sorry that I turned out this way. I have been a killer for 5 years and have killed 8 people, assaulted more. I guess I haven't learned anything. Dad always has worried about me because of what I have gone through in the divorce, finances, etc. I have been taking it out on different people. As I saw it, I was hoping they would catch me. I took 48 sleeping pills last night, and I woke up well rested. The night before, I took 2 bottles of pills to no avail. They will arrest me today." Later that same night, after dropping the letters he had written into the mail, Jesperson called Detective Buckner and confessed to the murder of Julianne Winningham. According to Jesperson, he confessed to Winningham's murder because he knew that he would either be sentenced to life in prison or executed, and in either case, he would no longer be in a position where he could kill another woman. 6 days later, Rick Buckner flew to Arizona to take Jesperson into his custody and return him to Washington State where he would be formally charged with Whittingham's murder. According to what Jesperson would later write, Buckner purportedly told him, "Wesley Allen Dodd once wore those same handcuffs." And Jesperson said in his writing that he thought to himself after Buckner's remarks, if he only knew what was in them now, he would faint. When he arrived in Washington, Jesperson called his brother and instructed him to destroy the letter he had sent to him. However, on the advice of a lawyer and Jesperson's father, his brother decided to turn the letter over to police because they felt it was unlawful to hold onto or destroy evidence. Shortly after it was turned over to the police, the letter was published by a number of newspapers. Meanwhile, Buckner began transmitting information about Jesperson to law enforcement agencies around the nation. He provided information about Jesperson's confession and the letter he had written to his brother, and inquired whether there were any jurisdictions that had unsolved homicides that might fit into Jesperson's travel itinerary. Within days, Buckner's office received 16 responses from law enforcement agencies as far away as New York and Florida, and the process of examining unsolved homicides in a number of states had begun. In addition to Jesperson's routes of travel, investigators took another look at the physical evidence that had been collected from a number of crime scenes involving murdered women, including bodily fluids for DNA analysis for a possible match to Jesperson. Focusing on female homicide victims found along major roadways and near truck stops, authorities in Oregon, Nevada, and Utah were among the first to begin re-examining their open cases. A particular interest to investigators in Oregon was an unsolved case involving a woman who disappeared from the vicinity of a truck stop in Wilsonville, in the northern part of the state, in August 1994, and whose body was eventually found along a highway near Medford in southern Oregon in March 1995, shortly after Jesperson's arrest. Authorities in Utah and the Great Basin area of northeastern Nevada also re-examined several unsolved homicides involving women to see if Jesperson somehow fit into the scheme of things. Although their gut instinct told them that Jesperson was probably their killer in a number of the cases they re-examined, they lacked sufficient evidence to bring any charges against him. Nowadays, it's no secret that those who have shown a propensity toward animal violence and abuse during their younger years sometimes move on to more violent crimes later in life that are directed at human beings. Jesperson once wrote from his prison cell at Oregon State Penitentiary, where he eventually became a permanent resident. It's in the crime journals of all major law enforcement agencies. Abusive behavior toward animals is one of the symptoms on the road to being a murderer. He wrote that it was in his early childhood that his aggression towards animals began, and explained that his father once witnessed him throw a cat against the pavement and finish it off by strangling it to death. Jesperson wrote that his father had appeared proud of him and how he had dealt with the cat, and bragged to others about how Keith had gotten rid of the stray cats and dogs in the mobile home park where they all lived. All this did is spawn in me the urge to kill again, Jesperson said. I began to think of what it would be like to kill a human being. The thought stayed with me for years until one night it happened. I killed a woman by beating her almost to death and finished her off by strangulation, he said, explaining how he had killed Tanya Bennett. No longer did I search for animals to mistreat. I now looked for people to kill, and I did. I killed over and over until I was caught. Now, I'm paying for it with the rest of my life behind bars. We should stop the cruelty to anything before it develops into a bigger problem, like me. Jesperson was clearly making an attempt to convince the public to buy into the idea that a compassionate side to him existed, where of course, none did. During his many letter-writing campaigns to reporters and writers with websites, Jesperson ran the gamut of trying to present different sides to his personality. In one letter, he might write about his compassionate side, and in another, he would refer to roadside victims as piles of garbage, an attempt to place doubt in the public and law enforcement's eyes that he was the killer, but had instead merely stumbled onto someone else's garbage, only to have a murder unfairly pinned on him after reporting finding the roadside bodies. In yet other letters, he would write about offering a self-start serial killer kit. This was his sick attempt at humor.
This is the offer you all have been dying for, the self-start serial killer kit. Now you can be the only serial killer on your block. Learn from a professional serial killer. Get rid of that unwanted family member. Get that job you always wanted by opening up the slot. Everyone will be dying to meet you. You get a full-life Julie Winningham look-alike doll with an extra tough spring-back neck, so you will soon have the strength to squeeze the shit out of anyone.
He would then say, "I enjoy screwing with the press and prosecutors through the press. I do what has to be done to get results." Often, as will be seen, the results that he often looked for was avoiding receiving a death sentence. While Jesperson sat in the Clark County Jail for the murder of Julie Winningham, he began talking to his attorney, Thomas Phelan, about other crimes that he had committed. The conversation began when Phelan asked Jesperson about the letter that he had written to his brother, which had been turned over to the police. In an adrenaline-scared rush, Jesperson began telling his innermost secrets to the attorney when he realized that he would be labeled as a serial killer after the police had linked him to additional killings. One of those cases involved the murder of the 21-year-old Angela Surprise. Against legal advice to keep his mouth shut, Jesperson decided to tell his account of Angela's murder to other inmates, who in turn reported what he had said to authorities. Everybody in prison is looking for their get-out-of-jail-free card. Clark County investigators relayed the information to their counterparts in Wyoming and Nebraska. Later, Jesperson would also talk to investigators about Angela's killing, as well as others, and would detail his accounts in his letter-writing campaign and internet postings made possible through the help of people willing to post his writings on their websites. According to Jesperson's account, he picked up Angela Surprise near Spokane, Washington in January 1995 and had agreed to give her a ride to Fort Collins, Colorado to see her father. At one point along the way, they stopped so that she could call her dad, who Jesperson would later claim told her that he didn't want to see her and to stay away. Afterward, Angela changed her mind about going to Fort Collins and asked Jesperson to take her to Indiana instead to visit a friend. In a rage, "I murdered her in Wyoming," Jesperson said. Jesperson went on to explain that he became enraged when Angela would not let him sleep when they had stopped at a truck stop just east of Cheyenne, Wyoming. She kept bitching at him to keep driving in bad weather, and he ended up strangling her by placing his fist tightly against her throat. Afterwards, he went back to sleep. When he awoke about 3 hours later, he drove on to Nebraska and pulled off into a rest area where he bound her body with black nylon rope and secured it face down beneath his rig. He dragged her body along the pavement for about 10 to 12 miles until it became loose. He then untied her body and threw it into a ditch situated about 75 feet off Interstate 80, some 250 miles east of the truck stop where he had killed her. The nylon rope was still attached to her ankles. Sergeant Terry Bolig of the Laramie County, Wyoming Sheriff's Department caught the assignment in that jurisdiction since it was believed that Angela had been killed in Wyoming. Bolig learned that Angela had led a transient lifestyle and, as such, had not been reported missing by family members. Bolig, however, eventually located her father by examining phone calls charged to a credit card believed to have belonged to Jesperson's brother. As spring slowly turned into summer, and summer just as slowly made its way into autumn, Keith Jesperson sat in a jail in Washington with little to do except to think about his crimes and make plans on how he might manipulate the system to his benefit as prosecutors built their cases against him for the murder of Julianne Winningham. Similarly, authorities from Wyoming confronted him with what little evidence and information they had regarding Angela Surprise. At one point, they showed him a photo of her in which he identified Angela as the person that he had picked up and killed. He also told the investigators about a significant detail that would leave little doubt in their minds that he was, for reasons known only to him, being truthful with them regarding Angela. He said she had a tattoo of the cartoon character Tweety Bird on one of her ankles, in which Tweety was making an obscene gesture with one of his hands. In September 1995, based on specific and accurate information from Jesperson relayed by Clark County, Washington investigators to their counterparts in Nebraska, a Nebraska highway patrolman found Angela's remains lying near the shoulder of Interstate 80 near Gothenburg, a small town of 3,200 residents located near the South Platte River, where it had been lying in tall grass for several months, probably since early January. Badly decomposed, most of her skin had decayed, and investigators were able to identify her only after examining pelvic x-rays and finding the tattoo of Tweety Bird that was still visible on one of her ankles, one of the only few identifying marks that remained on her body. As the Wyoming investigators continued to systematically build their case against Jesperson, one in which they hoped would eventually bring him the death penalty, Jesperson continued making plans of his own on how to manipulate the system to his benefit. Nonetheless, Jesperson was soon charged with Angela's murder, and Wyoming prosecutors promptly rejected an offer by his attorney for him to provide information in exchange for an agreement from Wyoming not to seek the death penalty. Meanwhile, investigators in Washington, California, and Oregon went to work examining Jesperson's handwriting. Because of the comments that he had been making to other inmates, and due to the letter that he had written to his brother, the investigators wanted to determine if Jesperson was the same person who had written the letters to the Oregonian columnist, claiming to have killed 3 women in California and 2 in Oregon. Using the letter that he wrote to his brother claiming to have killed 8 women over a 5-year period, the investigators saw similarities not only in the handwriting, but in the crimes themselves. Regarding one of the California victims, the Happy Face Killer wrote that he had used duct tape to bind her hands and feet, a fact that was never released to the public. Investigators also found duct tape near her body. Similarly, in statements he made to the police, Jesperson claimed to have taped Julie Winningham's mouth shut with duct tape, but there were discrepancies in the letters as well. In one Happy Face Killer letter, the writer claimed to have quit long-haul truck driving and was instead employed as a driver, where I'm in the public eye and out of harm's way. I got away from what became easy. I do not want to kill again. Yet another similarity in the letter writing between Jesperson and the happy-faced killer appeared when Jesperson wrote a letter to the Columbia newspaper in Vancouver, Washington, and had it smuggled out of jail. In that letter, he again alluded to a desire to be caught so that he would not kill again. He stated, "I know what I've done has been wrong, and I feel sorry for all of the families of my victims. I am, in fact, the happy-faced killer. I created that man because I wanted to be stopped, but it's hard to just come out and say it. I have prayed many nights in this cold, dark prison cell for the answer, and God has told me to come clear with it all. Tell the truth about everything. I will not be happy until I am replacing that man in the Oregon State Penitentiary for the crime I did, and he goes free. Most people will say that I am a monster. I'm not a monster. Just like the movie Jurassic Park, I was created by people." Jesperson's comments about John and their obvious relevance to the Tanya Bennett case naturally shocked the investigators, especially Detectives Carson and Ingram and Prosecutor McIntyre, who were responsible for putting John and Laverne behind bars. His comments marked the first time that anyone had sown any seeds of doubt that the right suspects had been prosecuted. Naturally, all those involved were inclined to believe that Jesperson was lying, and that they had convicted the right people for Bennett's murder. "As soon as I feel we have the wrong people in jail, you'll probably catch me going to Salem to get them out," Multnomah County District Attorney Michael Shrunk said of Jesperson's remarks. In the meantime, Jesperson's attorney went to work setting up a plea bargain agreement between the state of Oregon and Jesperson regarding Bennett's murder. In writing the letter to the Columbian, Jesperson realized that he would need the help of public opinion if he were going to be able to convince the authorities that he had killed Tanya Bennett. When one looks at Keith Jesperson's case as a whole, it becomes easier to see that his motivation for confessing to Tanya's murder was not so much out of the desire to come clean, or that he was being sympathetic or empathetic, but was in all likelihood motivated more out of his desire for self-preservation. Jesperson knew that if extradited to Wyoming, he would face a penalty of death for the murder of Angela Soubise. However, if he were able to confess to Tanya Bennett's murder and be sentenced to death in Oregon, a state where a death sentence hasn't been carried out since the early 1960s, he knew that he could at the very least postpone any actions that Wyoming might be able to carry out against him. It was even likely that Oregon would not sentence him to death, but would give him life in prison instead if his attorney was successful in working out a plea agreement. At any rate, he would later reveal that his reasoning had been that his confession and subsequent sentence in Oregon would make it ultimately more difficult for Wyoming to get its hands on him. The press appeared more than eager to help out as reporters from a number of newspapers contacted Jesperson about the claims he was making. He told them that Laverne and John were innocent and had been sent to prison for a crime he had committed. According to Jesperson, the police did not believe him at first and insisted that they had the right people in jail for Bennett's murder. It wasn't until he insisted that he could lead them to the location of Tanya's purse and Oregon identification card, something Laverne had been unable to do, that they finally began to show interest. It wasn't until after Jesperson had led the detectives to those critical pieces of evidence lying behind a bush near the Sandy River that they began to believe him. When taken to the location where Bennett's body was found, he provided them with information about the body and its position, details that no one other than the killer and the cops could know. Adding credence to what Jesperson had provided them, Jesperson told the investigators to review his lawyer's notes that had been compiled in May 1995, before the press or anyone else had any idea that Jesperson might be the happy face killer, who had written intimate details about the case to the Oregonian. Jesperson, through his attorney, indicated that he was willing to plead no contest to the murder of Tanya Bennett. In the meantime, it was agreed that Laverne and Keith Jesperson would undergo polygraph examinations, which would be administered by the FBI. The results of the polygraph tests indicated that Laverne was being truthful in her denial that she had killed Bennett, and that Jesperson was being truthful in his claim of being the killer. The result of the tests also showed that Jesperson and Laverne did not know each other. Based on this new information, District Attorney Michael Shrunk filed a motion in Marion County, where the Oregon State Penitentiary is located, asking for the immediate release of Laverne and John. Shrunk told presiding Marion County Circuit Court Judge Paul Lipscomb that Laverne and John had served more than 4 years in prison for a crime they hadn't committed. He also outlined the evidence that Jesperson had provided. However, Lipscomb refused to immediately release the couple. Instead, the judge said that he would consider an evidentiary hearing after Jesperson entered his plea, in which Jesperson could testify on behalf of Laverne and John. "It's extraordinary," Shrunk said afterwards. "You don't see prosecutors doing this all of the time. It's the appropriate thing to do under the appropriate circumstances." He emphasized that there were no improprieties on the part of the judge, the jury, or the lawyers when Laverne and John were convicted. The evidence they had at the time was ample evidence to convict. There are a lot of dynamics to this case, and you would have to have been there to understand, Deputy DA James McIntyre said. McIntyre, who prosecuted the case, said that he did not owe anyone an apology for having prosecuted a case that sent 2 innocent people to prison. "What I will say is that based upon the evidence we discovered in interviewing Jesperson, we couldn't have obtained these convictions." Laverne's family, meanwhile, remained hopeful that the judge would do the right thing and release Laverne and John from prison. "We're happy, but not happy enough," one of Laverne's relatives said after the judge's decision. "We need the release order signed before we get real happy. The case should have never gone to trial. If the jury had heard the whole truth, they would have never been convicted. She," referring to Laverne, "always read mystery books and murder books. She read in the paper that this girl had been murdered and that the police didn't have a suspect, so she gave them a suspect." In the meantime, while Jesperson waited to enter his plea for murdering Tanya Bennett, and as the state of Wyoming continued building its case against him for the murder of Angela Surprise, Jesperson continued his many contacts with the news media, claiming responsibility for the murder of a number of other women. After Bennett, Jesperson said, "There was Claudia, a girl wanting a ride to Phoenix, Arizona with me. She tried to extort my wallet from me and died trying. Then there was Cynthia Lynn Rose, a prostitute working the southbound rest area on Highway 99 near Turlock, California. Then Lori Ann Pentland, a prostitute working the Burns Brothers truck stop in Wilsonville, Oregon. Then a Jane Doe prostitute working the Petro truck stop in Corning, California. Then a woman I gave a ride to in Florida, going to Lake Tahoe, Nevada. She called herself Susanna." Jesperson also claimed that he was responsible for the murders of the following women: Bobby, in Oregon, October 27, 1992; Lynn, in Nevada, January 1993; Susan, in Oklahoma, January 1993; Linda, in Washington, March 1993; Sunny, in Arizona, April 1993; Jane Doe, in Idaho, April 1993; Jane Doe, in California, May 1993; Jane Doe, in California, July 1993; Jane Doe, in Arizona, September 1993; Carrie, in Idaho, November 1993; Karen, in Georgia, February 1994; Carol, in Nevada, February 1994; Jane Doe, in Nebraska, October 1994; Jane Doe, in Iowa, February 1995; and Jane Doe, in Indiana, February 1995. There were others that he could not name or provide a location for. All in all, he said, he was responsible for at least 160 slayings across the United States. Jesperson told the media that he was admitting to all of these murders because he was bothered by a guilty conscience. However, like Henry Lee Lucas before him, Jesperson would later recant most of his confession. At one point, according to an account by the Happy Face Killer himself, Jesperson was visited by investigators from what was then left of the Green River Killer Task Force, wanting to know if he was responsible for any of the still unsolved killings in their jurisdiction. Since many of Jesperson's victims were known sex workers and strangulation was his preferred method of murder, Jesperson naturally looked like a feasible candidate in at least some of the Green River killings, which we now know was Gary Ridgway. In October 1995, just before his trial was slated to begin, Keith Jesperson pled guilty to the murder of Julianne Winningham before Clark County, Washington Superior Court Judge Robert L. Harris. Harris, the same judge who presided over the Wesley Ann Dodd case, would sentence Jesperson to life in prison in December following proceedings in Oregon. Meanwhile, Jesperson waived extradition from Clark County and was transferred to Oregon. On Thursday, November 2, 1995, after waiving all of his rights, he entered a no-contest plea before Judge Donald H. Launder for the murder of Tanya Bennett. Launder immediately sentenced Jesperson to life in prison, setting a minimum 30-year prison term before being eligible for parole. Launder's sentence, in effect, gave Jesperson exactly what he had wanted, namely prison time in Oregon. Proceedings elsewhere would require extradition, meeting considerable expense and a lot of red tape. The Oregon sentence made potential death penalties in other states less likely, and Jesperson knew it. The no-contest plea and subsequent sentence also set the final wheels for Laverne and John's release from prison into motion. However, there was another Oregon case involving Jesperson that had to be dealt with in the meantime: the murder of 23-year-old Lori Ann Pentland. According to the Marion County District Attorney's Office, investigators linked Jesperson to Pentland's murder through DNA and other forensic evidence, after learning that Jesperson was the Happy Face Killer. Jesperson had written letters as the Happy Face Killer after Pentland's murder, claiming responsibility for her death, and had said that she was an acquaintance and that he had contacted via Citizens Band radio while in the Salem area. In one of the letters, he said that he'd had sex with her several times. I felt so much power, he had written as the happy-faced killer. I then told her she was going to die, and slowly strangled her. Jesperson was again sentenced to life in prison in Oregon, with a 30-year minimum term before parole eligibility. Following his sentencing in Washington, he was transferred to Oregon State Penitentiary to begin serving consecutive sentences. If he remains alive to complete his sentences in Oregon, he will be transferred to Washington State Penitentiary to begin serving his life sentence there. On November 27, 1995, after serving more than 4 years in prison for a crime they did not commit, Laverne and John were released from prison. Jesperson purportedly cried when he learned of their release. It wasn't known, however, whether his tears were tears of happiness for the couple or tears of regret for having confessed to a murder that he could have gotten away with. More than 2 years later, and considerable legal wrangling, the state of Wyoming finally succeeded in extraditing Jesperson for trial for the murder of Angela Surprise. For the next few months, as prosecutors prepared to go to trial, Jesperson taunted the authorities and threatened to force a costly trial by changing his story regarding the jurisdiction in which he had killed Angela. At one point, he said he had killed her in Wyoming. At another point, he claimed he had killed her in Nebraska. After going back and forth for some time surrounding Jesperson's deliberate misleading statements, in his attempt to confuse authorities on who had jurisdiction to prosecute him, a deal was worked out. Jesperson agreed to plead guilty to murdering Angela Surprise in Wyoming if Laramie County prosecutors would agree to not seek the death penalty against him. As a result, on June 3, 1998, District Judge Nicholas Kalokathis sentenced Jesperson to life in prison and ordered that the sentence run consecutive to the 2 life sentences in Oregon and the life sentence in Washington, leaving little doubt that he would die in prison. Afterward, he was promptly returned to the Oregon State Penitentiary. It remains to be seen whether any other jurisdictions, such as the state of Florida or California, will prosecute Jesperson for murders that he confessed to in those states. In November 2008, Jesperson's daughter, Melissa G. Moore, appeared on the Dr. Phil show to talk about her father. She was also featured on The Oprah Winfrey Show on September 17, 2009. The Lifetime Movies Network series Monster in My Family, episode titled Happy Face Killer, Keith Hunter Jesperson, on July 1, 2015, and on a 2020 special on August 20th of 2010. In 2008, Moore published a book titled Shattered Silence, The Untold Story of a Serial Killer's Daughter. Moore lived with her father until her parents divorced in 1990. Moore noticed her father was different when she was in elementary school. Their house bordered an apple orchard, and her dad killed stray cats and gophers that wandered nearby. So this leads us to our task for the week. What are the secrets in this case? From Laverne and John's involvement, how desperate was Laverne to land herself in jail for over 4 years simply to get away from her abuser? What was Keith Hunter Jesperson's motive for killing? And what did all of their actions reveal? It's their secrets, but we can always look for answers. I'm John Dodson, and this has been The Secret Sits. Audio engineering by Gabriel Dodson. Original artwork provided by Tony Lay.